Hey guys, thanks for joining me on this Sunday afternoon. Mutant XP on the mic live with another episode of the Mutant XPerience Third Strike Podcast, episode 47. And a very special podcast because with me today, my guest, one of the, I guess I would say, original Third Strike SoCal Ken players, definitely someone that I would put on the Mount Rushmore of SoCal Ken players, Dirt Strike. We have Paulee with us. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, how are you doing? Obviously, a lot of stuff going on in the world today, but hopefully everything's good with you. Family, friends are safe. And so thanks again, Paul, for coming on.
Thanks for having me. 2020 is an interesting year, but
yeah,
I'm happy to
definitely.
be here. Thank you.
So, for those of you who have listened to previous, actually, before we get into all that, Paul, just to kind of break the ice, another SoCal Ken player, legendary SoCal Ken player, someone you're very familiar with, Ed Ma. When I told him that I was going to have you on the podcast, a few days ago, he implored me to remind you that he is the true originator of Jump Jab.
Nope.
Nope, that's not true.
This is what we're coming to 20 years later. I will say, at best, we came up with it at the same time, but I absolutely came up with it on my own.
Okay. But in terms of,
don't know,
Mhm.
was God, I don't even remember. It's been so long. I think what was it? We would just jump in with jump jab for the final hit. I think it was, and I think because of the pressure you in with the last hit, people would input too early, and they would basically walk into the jump jab, and they would die. And it was actually a pretty hilarious way to finish the round. And then for whatever reason, because of the way the game worked, the engine works, if you do jump jab, I may be a little off on this, but if somebody uppercuts, you still had the ability to parry, something like that. So it was a pretty safe option. Or maybe it was like you just jump. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, I would just jump in with jab, and people would just walk into it and die like all the time. But Ed Ma, if he wants to take that take, screw you, first of all. But no, I never copied it from Ed Ma. I did come up with it my own, and if we came up with it independently, then that's the takeaway I'll allow.
Mm-hmm. So obviously you can't parry after you input a move, but I think what makes it so powerful is that you can buffer a parry as you jump. One of the things.
No, it wasn't the up forward parry. It was. I don't remember what it was, but there was also. For instance, if you did jump jab and they jump parry or parried it, you had a window where I can actually counter parry afterwards, right? Isn't that right?
Wait, after you press the input.
Right, like, so if I hit a button and they parry it, like my input is now done, I'm allowed to counter parry afterwards. Like
while you're still in the air. I'm still in the
air. I'd have to double check. Anthony, it's been a long time. But I think for the most part, it was just, I think the humiliating and embarrassing part was I would jump jab and they would basically input parry too early, as if I was hitting a jump roundhouse. And because the hitbox is smaller, they basically just walk into it every time.
So KD Alpha in the chat, he's going to be our fact checker. It'll be like the debates. He'll be the fact checker. So thank you, KD Alpha.
If I did a jump forward and you parried it, I think I could parry afterwards, couldn't I?
Like
there's some instances like that. I don't remember. It's been a long time, but I think you could. There were instances where we could trade parries in the air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyways, so another thing that I saw you and Ed do is like you said, at the end of the round, you would get right in front of your opponent, and then you would neutral jump. You would either neutral jump jab or neutral jump short. I used to see you and Ed do that. I don't know if it was by accident or. But that's something that stuck with me.
That does not sound familiar to me. If I did that one, it was probably on accident.
Yeah. So, let's start at the beginning, Paul, because, there are so many new Third Strike players. Again, you're someone who has played the game, at its really close to at its inception, but we're going to get to the specifics of that in a little bit. But it's 2020, and because of a mixture of a lot of different mitigating factors, a lot of people have been picking up the game, mostly online, of course, because it's 2020. When you hear about a game like Third Strike, you can't just run to an arcade and play it, right? The first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to play it online. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of Third Strike players, that are, might be a little bit familiar with you, but mostly that are very unfamiliar with you.
Sure.
And and like I said before in previous podcasts, I've referred to you a lot. Namely, I've kind of credited you as the person who really kind of, like, without you, I wouldn't have ever played Third Strike. And it's not because of, it's not because you ever set me aside. I mean, maybe a couple of times I remember, but it's never because, you like, I know this is going to sound, I don't want to make it sound like you're like, a mean person or anything, but like, it was just the way it was back in the day, right? Like, you never set me aside, or you never tried to, like, train me or teach me or whatever. And I understand that. But if you never played Third Strike, I would never have played Third Strike.
What are you trying to say is that you saw an average player like me have success with Third Strike, and in your mind, you thought if he can do it, anybody can do it. I get it. It's all right.
But, before we get into your story, I just wanted to kind of just give you an idea of what I've been saying about you, in previous podcasts. So, I don't know exactly, when it started, but I think I started going to Southern Hills with my best friend to this day. Remember Marvin, aka Mr. Universe. Shout out to Mr. Universe, still in SoCal, holding it down. And so we started going to Southern Hills pretty regularly, around 2001, 2002. But it was still at that point, I was still a very casual player. Mainly, I went there for KOF because I was an Alpha 3. But one of my earliest memories, of playing Third Strike is going to Southern Hills Golfland and seeing you, Mike Burke, Ken I, sometimes Don, Ghetto D, Don Sneddon. And I remember the Third Strike machine where it was right across. So for anyone who's never been to Southern Hills Golfland, it's a pretty, looking back on it now, it's a pretty cramped place. And so I remember the Third Strike machine, at least at the time, was right across from like the change area, or like the person, or like where you got food and change and stuff. Yeah, the pizza stand, right? And so that's kind of my earliest memories of playing Third Strike.
Sure.
And then really during that time, it was clear that, there were people that were very serious about the game. I was just kind of, again, I had no idea how to play Street Fighter competitively. I had just not even the clue. Some would argue I still don't, but, that's another topic for another day. But, that was kind of my earliest memories of Third Strike. And I would always mention in previous podcasts how I would just feed money. It was like, and you would just stand, because a lot of times Third Strike wasn't really that popular.
Right.
At least when I started coming to Southern Hills Golfland, it was mainly Marvel, KOF, CVS2 would come out a little bit later. And really Third Strike was really not all that popular. Sure. And I just remember you being there pretty consistently all the time. And you just, and I think I mentioned this in a most recent podcast, like looking back on it, like all I want to say to you is sorry. I apologize for wasting your time because I'm just trying to think of all, like, I must have spent, I'm trying to, I don't really know exactly how to quantify it, but just in terms of hours and quarters, just playing you, and you just playing me. Like, I don't think I could, thinking back on it, I don't think I could do the same thing, right? Because
do you remember what character you were choosing? Because this was pre-Necro. Were you using your
Ken?
Was it Ken?
Ken, yeah.
Okay.
We were just playing Ken mirrors, basically.
Yeah, Ken mirrors. So,
and yeah.
My response to that was this was absolutely when American Third Strike was completely dead. Before the resurgence. And I was so desperate for competition that there's no reason to apologize. I was going there on Friday and Saturday nights, and there was no competition whatsoever. Alex for whatever reason, God bless his soul, would come over and play me. But other than that, Alex Valle. But there was very little competition at that time. So thank you.
Yeah, I really did feel like a training dummy, like to you. Like looking back on it, it was just me allowing you to practice your execution and your combos, because there was no way, because I had no, and I just want to mention this now, because in case I forget, because I'm getting older and sometimes I forget now. But I remember a little bit later on, and this is sort of after I started going to tournaments with with my group of players from UC Irvine, right. Team Control. And I was dating someone at the time who went to Cal Poly Pomona. I think this was around 2005, 2004. And, by that time, Evo Moment 37 had already happened. And I was starting to kind of get, wow, maybe this Kent thing isn't working. And again, at that point, I still had really no idea, how to play the game. Oh, I mean, it was before Evo Moment 37. And I remember I would go to Cal Poly Arcade in the basement. I'm sure you remember that place. And I remember distinctly one day, Hung was there, Hung B, SoCal Oro player, someone that I'm sure you're very familiar with. I think you guys are pretty good friends. I remember one day Hung just set me aside, and he just so plainly said, man, like, I can teach you how to play this game if you want. Like, I can actually teach you how to play this game. That's awesome. At the time, right? You're in your early 20s. You got you got the ego. So I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, outwardly, I was like, oh, that's cool, man. I get it. But in my mind, I'm like, what the fuck is this asshole, dog? Like, it just came up to me and just be like, like, who does he think he is, right? Or whatever. But just anyway, yeah.
If anybody knows Hung is the nicest person.
He is
on the planet. So if anything, he was trying to be, it was a gesture. Obviously, like you said, there's an ego at play, and from your mind, you're kind of like, dude, whatever. Like, we're not, we're competitors, right? But Hung is the nicest person I've ever met by far. So that's a pretty funny story about him.
And another thing that really stands out, just kind of piggyback off your point, Paul. This was at a time when no one really did that.
Sure. Yeah.
No one really did that.
Right.
And so, looking back on it, right? Like, I even at the time, I understood, wow, like, no one's ever actually done that, ever. Like, no one's ever come up to me and gone, hey, like, I can actually teach you the game if you want.
Yeah, it's true, but it was also right at the cusp of when, like you said, like, Team Control and, like, Team Run, like, people were starting to put those together with the power of the internet. We were also growing up, so we had cars, right?
Well, some of
it was kind of the beginning, I think, of a group mindset to a lot of these games, because before that, it was you just go to the arcade, you plunk down your quarter, and you learn whatever you can, in that 5 minutes that you have control. If you get your butt kicked, I hope you learn from it. Otherwise, you put another quarter up, and otherwise, it just happens again.
So on that note, let's kind of start at the beginning, Paul. Why Street Fighter? Like, exactly how did you get into Street Fighter?
So, I'm probably one of the oldest players in the scene. I know there's a few older, but I ironically did start with Street Fighter 1. Okay. My friend at the time, this was at the beginning, we were, I don't know, who knows, right? Like 8, 9 years old. We would go to the movie theater and we'd play Street Fighter 1. And it was basically only against the computer. Because the controls were so horrible on Street Fighter 1 that you really couldn't play in a versus scenario. So we were sitting there mashing, trying to get out fireballs, because if you got a fireball in Street Fighter 1, it would take off like a third of their life. We didn't know about Shoryukens until actually I have an interesting story. So we used to go down to the movie theaters or the bowling alleys, whatever, and we'd mash fireballs. We finally got to the last character one time. I think it's the only time we got to the last character. We were using Ken, ironically. But we were mashing fireballs, and my friend mashed out an actual Shoryuken, which I'd never even seen before. Hit Sagat twice, just like the ending of the game. Hit him twice. It's basically 100% damage in Street Fighter 1. So he mashed out an uppercut, finished off Saget, and the game ended. And that was like probably the last time we played Street Fighter 1, but it ended just like the storyline. So it's kind of funny.
So, quick question. What type of controls were on the Street Fighter 1?
So it was not the single button that I've heard of. I've heard of that. I've never seen that. I think I may have seen it one time at a nickel arcade, but no, we never had the single button, and the damage is based on how hard you hit it. I've heard of that. I haven't seen that. We had, for the old school players, it's jab, strong, fierce, short, medium, or short. What is it? Forward and roundhouse. So it's still the 6 button, but we would drive down there. I grew up in San Diego, to give a little bit more background. So our main arcades was, we had UTC, which was a popular spot back in the day. I didn't know it at the time, but it was one of the big spots in California, which makes it one of the big spots in the country. And then the same owner for UTC had a smaller joint down in was Hazard Center, but by the stadium in San Diego. So yeah, we used to play there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I've seen the Street Fighter 1 cab where you had to actually physically strike the cabinet.
Right.
I've seen it once, and it was
with a button, right? Single button.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I heard of that.
I think I saw it, and I told myself to try and remember the name of this arcade, but it was in the Pasadena area. I don't know if maybe you have any insight on this, but that's like the only place that I've seen it. I've only seen it once physically.
Heard of it.
So Street Fighter 1 came, and then like in terms of competitive Street Fighter, like what's your sort of earliest recollection in terms of being aware that there are, because again, you're like from the very beginning. So like when was like your earliest recollection in terms of tournaments and a competitive scene for Street Fighter?
Which is funny. So I played Street Fighter growing up, but I didn't end up in the competitive scene until a little bit later. So the OG players, so let's just like say Alex Valle and John Choi would consider me at the time a newer player. Considering that the scene is mostly 09ers and earlier now, or later, I guess, whatever, I am considered an OG by those standards. But so I was playing Hyper Fighting in, what do you call it, Championship Edition, kind of in local arcades, right? Local arcades and, the bowling alleys and things like that. And I was kind of killing people, and it was fine. But I got into competitive Street Fighter when I went to school. So I went to UCLA. This was 97 to 2001. The guy that ran the arcade, or who worked at the arcade, was somebody you may know. His name is James Chen. So he ran, or was a manager at Xscape. And at that time, I think Alpha 3 came out. So we were playing Alpha 3. James would hop on there when he wasn't playing. And every weekend, it seems like he would come back and have some new technique. And I was just, I was going there in between classes. And I think I started talking with him and communicating with him, or connecting with him and some of his friends. We had a little group. And he told me about Southern Hills Golfland. So that's where that came into play. So at the time, I was playing Alpha 3, as struggly as you can imagine, because we didn't have internet. But he would come back, and he was playing A Guy at the time. He'd come back on the weekends and just pull out some really neat stuff, new competitive stuff. So that's how I found about Southern Hills. So the story can kind of branch into two ways. So eventually I did start making my way down to Southern Hills to play. So that's how that ends up. But from a competition standpoint, we played Alpha 3 for a while. That game kind of came and went. It's still the greatest Street Fighter game of all time, by the way. But Third Strike came out. And you may not know this, but I hated Third Strike as a game. I went so far as to write, I don't know, like a 2-page essay on why I thought Third Strike was a terrible game.
And where was this essay?
It was on, what do you call it? Like, what did we use before that? It was before
IRC?
It was before IRC, but it was like a bulletin board. What was the bulletin? It was like Capcom, BBS, or something like that. So this was what people used before SRK and BBC. Before SRK. There was a bulletin board system, and people were I mean, they put up the moves for that's how basic it was back then. But we put up the moves, and I put up a 1 or 2 page essay about why I thought Third Strike was a bad game, and primarily it was because it was slow. I don't remember what else, but the only reason I played Third Strike was because I was kind of like SHGL. I was just desperate for competition. Like people were not playing very much. I just sat there and I was playing, and it was the only thing I could do. Over time, they started running some smaller tournaments, and I would go to Golfland. And for whatever reason, I found out that I was actually one of the better players, and I don't know, kind of built from there.
Yeah, so Alpha 3, if I recall correctly, came out I think around 98. And then Third Strike came out shortly after. And I had a somewhat similar experience with Third Strike, at least initially. The first time I played Third Strike, and I've repeated this story, plenty of times, but the first time, I still remember the first time I played Third Strike, and it was at Regency Fun Center in Lakewood. And me and Marvin went over there because he said, "Hey, there's this new Street Fighter 3 game." Because my earliest experience with the Street Fighter 3 series was New Gen. I grew up in Monterey Park. And so, remember back in those days, Monterey Park, whenever a new arcade game came out, I mean, it was there. It would be in, random bodegas or random pirated video game stores everywhere. And so, I remember when New Gen came out, me and Marvin just kind of played it, and it was cool because I don't know if you remember this, but there was always this big sort of anticipation about Street Fighter 3.
Sure. Oh yeah, there was this, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't think people realized back then that we didn't know if there was going to be a Street Fighter 3. There was this massive gap between Street Fighter 2 and all the various iterations afterwards, which was Turbo, and then Super, which is basically a pre-release version of Super Turbo. And we never knew that if there was going to be a Third Strike. And I remember where I was. I walked into like a movie theater arcade in San Diego, and Street Fighter 3 was out, and I was blown away because I had no idea that they were even planning on doing this, and there it was sitting in front of me.
And the marketing, I talked to other guests about this before, but the marketing for the New Gen series was really weird because I don't know if you remember, but the marquee on the top, it didn't say Street Fighter, right? It just said 3.
It said 3, yeah. And it was like Sean was like the main character.
Yeah, and then the only characters that you would recognize are Ryu and Ken. And so it was a completely different cast.
Absolutely. Weird.
And it was just really, really weird. And I felt, I don't know if you felt this, but I felt this kind of surprise and shock when I saw the game because it was like, it almost came out of nowhere, despite all of the anticipation.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. I had no idea the game was even coming back, and I'm not saying I was like completely in tune with games back then, but for me to play, Street Fighter for an extended period and then walk into an arcade and go like, holy crap, Street Fighter 3's out. I had no idea it was supposed to be coming out.
One of the things that I've kind of learned through conversations with, retro heads, arcade purists, people who collect and are interested about this kind of stuff. One of the things that they pointed out to me was just how expensive it was for arcade owners to get CPS3 games, because not only of the price of the hardware, but just how difficult it was to handle CPS3 boards. Like if we think about CPS2 games, they had a shell, you could, they had a board A and board B. So it was really easy to kind of swap out different games, because you had a main motherboard to use.
Yeah.
But for the CPS3 games, it was like all these different parts. And, in America, they came with the metal case. But I heard in Japan, they didn't have that. And so I think it was definitely maybe a combination of a lot of different factors.
Yeah. So as far as competitive, kind of how my route took me there was, so then I was going down to Southern Hills. James Chen introduced me to that, and I was going down to there, and I was playing at that cab that we talked about earlier. And Alex Valle, God bless his soul, I don't know why exactly he did it, but he saw it maybe as a challenge, but he would come over and play me, and he was probably the only one playing me at the time. I think most people were playing Marvel 2 at the time, which I played too. But Marvel 2 was definitely the big thing. But he would come over and challenge me, and I learned an absolute ton from Alex. We were in a position where I think UCLA was running small tournaments, and I don't think Southern Hills was, but whoever was running these small tournaments, and I would come, and I would usually probably win. And then I played Alex in a tournament, and I literally threw out my entire game because all he did was stand on the ground and try to footsie me. And before that, so I'm playing at UCLA. UCLA's throwing these little tournaments, and I would just basically jump in a ton, and I would jump in and parry, and I was parrying them on reaction, everything they did. And if they didn't, then I would, then I've got a jump forward, and then they're in a bad spot. That game did not work against Alex. So basically Alex was using standing jab as an anti-air. So he introduced me to that. And then he was maintaining ground control with crouching forward. And I just remember sitting there going, I have to throw out my entire game and learn what he's doing, because this guy comes and he doesn't play it right. We're playing it full time. He's just abusing the powerful system. And I needed to know how to do that. And so I threw out my old game. I started using Super 3 instead of Super 2. I was using Super 2 back then. This actually might even be after the first Midwest Championship that I went to. It's possible it's after that, because at that time, so I went to Midwest Championship, and I think I lost to Shen.
Do you remember what year that was around?
The first Midwest would have been around 98, 99, something like that. I got fourth.
Third Strike came out in 99, so it had to have been like 2000. So it had to have been 2000, maybe?
Probably 2000. Yeah. So I don't remember. There's little. I wouldn't just obviously just go to a turn to Midwest Championships without thinking. But I remember having a lot of success versus players. I remember being surprised. I would play against out of town. I think at Evo, maybe it was at Evo, like people would come in and they would have this scene. They would say they were really great at Third Strike, and they would come in. I would actually just mop them, like no problem. So I don't know if you remember there was a Nebraska scene for a while.
Oh yeah. Nebraska, there's still some players that continue to play. So there was a lot of those players are still active
at the time, and of course they're talking their smack, and it was just everything was so regional at the time. So I remember we went to Midwest, and Nebraska met up with me. This is the same year, and I don't mean to talk smack, but I didn't have a problem with any player from Nebraska, and so none of them finished top. I think Dietrich finished top 4. I beat him or something like that, but I think you could see on their eyes, it was just limited information. Like they came in and they were using Alex, a lot of Alex. And they were using stun gut headbutt. So I remember the first time he did a setup, and I just jabbed it. And you could see them, like he's like mid-tournament, and he's never seen an anti-stun gun jab before. And you could just see like there was this level of knowledge that they just hadn't achieved yet. And I remember I was proud of that. I'm sorry guys if that hurts your feelings, but I played them and they had some learning to do. But yeah, then so I did okay in that one. I lost to Shen. I think I lost the Flash G as well. And this was, he was playing Akuma, and I was using, this is before I knew anything, right? I was playing SA2. Just horrible. And then he just jumped back fireball for like the entire thing, and I had no idea what to do. And I think by the second time, I think I finally realized like you could insta air jump EX fireball, EX hurricane Tatsu. And that you can shut that down, but that wasn't until like I'd already lost. So and then like I said, and then Alex basically, like I said, he didn't take me aside, although we did become very good friends afterwards. But he definitely, in a competitive way, basically was like, I can see you like this game. We're gonna play this. I knew he didn't like it particularly well, but he basically was like, we're gonna play this and we're gonna grind.
So a lot of the players that you mentioned, particularly the ones that went to Midwest, like Flash G, also obviously from New York, a lot of those players had played Second Impact competitively.
Sure, right.
But did you ever play Second Impact competitively?
I didn't. Again, this has to do with basically opportunity. And I was at UCLA, and we had a giant Alpha 3 cab and a giant Third Strike cab. And that was it. So I played what I thought people would play me at. And that was it.
Now, do you think, I mean, I don't know if you ever thought about this. You know, when you look at the leap between Second Impact and Third Strike, which is something we talk about a lot in this podcast, you know, just how different Second Impact is from the third iteration, you know, in terms of everything, right? Aesthetics, the way the game feels, gameplay, and stuff like that. I mean, do you think, you know, do you think it helped, at least at the very beginning, players who had played competitive Second Impact, or do you think it hurt them more? Because, you know, you had mentioned how you were surprised at how well you did against a lot of these players, and a lot of the players that you mentioned had played Second Impact competitively. Have you ever thought about that at all? Or
I haven't. I just never really had enough experience with Second Impact to really make that comment. It's a good question. I know. You know, there's players. So like Eddie Lee was good, but I don't know. It seems to me, if I had to make a comment, I would say that I don't think it translated well. You know what I mean? I wouldn't be able to back that up because I just didn't play Second Impact as much. But I think, you know, Third Strike was slower. And I know basically they neutered all the combos from Second Impact. Second Impact.
Well, everything worked in Second Impact.
Yeah. Second Impact was a hyper offensive game. And then Third Strike was really like you just needed to find some really strong fundamentals and just abuse that. At least at a mid-high level, you know. So I'm talking Chun-Li back fierce, Chun-Li low forward in super, Ken crouching forward, Ken crouching strong, know your parries, know your anti-air. And that carried us for the first 5 years of Third Strike, to be honest.
Yeah. Before we take our first break, you know, when you think about the word footsies, right? That's a word that you kind of, you know, you mentioned. And like for anyone that's been in the FGC, it's kind of one of those, footsies, right? But, you know, because you know, you were at a time in the scene where it was still very early. You know, of course there are OGs before you, right? But like, when did you know, because sometimes I talk to Third Strike players about like that moment where things kind of click, right? When you start to understand, oh, this is how I play the game. And you know, that applies to really any fighting game, right? Hyper fighting, you know, or at least any iteration of Street Fighter. Like, was there a moment when it just kind of clicked for you? Like, oh, okay, it's not just about pressing buttons and mashing, you know, it's something else. There's something different. Like, can you kind of remember what happened in that moment for you, or when that moment happened?
Absolutely. It's what I was talking about earlier with Alex. So prior to that, I was doing a lot of jumping and then parrying, and people just, you know, they'd uppercuts, you parry. You know, if they didn't uppercut, then they're stuck in a bad situation where I can do mix up, throw, walk up short, strong fierce, all that stuff. And they were in a bad spot. Whereas Alex basically, he used standing, you know, his anti-airs. So he shut down my jumps. So basically I had to completely throw out jumps, which was my entire game. And then if you shut down the air, if you have a strong anti-air game, then you have ground game. And his ground game was walk forward, and low medium kick, walk towards crouch roundhouse at max range, and then footsie, which is you walk in and out of that range. And if I, as the opposing player, whiffed a move, crouching medium kick, he would punish with either crouching roundhouse or crouching forward, which none of us knew, you know, that you could do reliably. And so to me, he opened my eyes. And so that game became no more jumping, walk on the ground, walk in and out of crouch round medium kick range, and then either advance with crouching medium kick as a counter hit, or as a hit confirm, or max range roundhouse when nobody has any meter. So you have a lot of incentive to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you describe Valle, you know, of course, Valle is still in the scene, and he's one of the few players that's been able to transition, you know, from, you know, a competitor to, one of the most, sort of valuable, and important people in the FGC today,
Mhm.
as far as, running events and encouraging new players to enter the scene. But just to hear you just to hear you describe kind of Valle, it just, he was just so ahead of his time, it seems.
Sure,
Um,
and it wasn't limited to him.
yeah.
So there's a reason that the players that were at the top of Street Fighter at the time did
Hmm.
not like Third Strike, and the reason was because you can simplify the game at, we'll call it, middle to high middle level, which is all that US Third Strike was at the time. So players like him and John Choi, and Ricky to an extent, you could just play strong anti-air and footsie, and you
Hmm.
beat everybody.
Hmm.
Everybody. So like I would play against John, and he was just like, this game is so boring. He's just like, and he would just jump in and out. Like he would just play Super Turbo and CBS, and he was like, okay, we have to play Third Strike. Okay, you play, and he would just beat almost everybody with just crouch medium kick, and that guy could hit confirm both the Dragon Punch and supers, no problem. Which was something that very few people were doing at the time, but it just
Hmm.
goes to show you. So him and Alex were just hit confirming, crouching medium kick. They were playing chess while everyone else was playing tic tac toe. And that's why they didn't like the game, because all you did was abuse two things. What's the fun in that? When the resurgence came, and we'll talk about it later. But the resurgence came after, I think it was like Co-op 1 came out in Japan or something like that, and it just unleashed a whole new information to us. And then we had the advanced level. That's the family fun era. Denjin came out, Genai Jin came out, and Urians came out, and all that stuff. Then just sitting on the fundamentals, it still worked to an extent, but there was more. You could do more, right? You could do Makoto, you could do all these different things. So the game opened up, and this is 5 years after the game was out, before Third Strike took off.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, when I think about, one of the first notable videos of American Third Strike, I think about, the B5, or was it called B5? It was called B5, right? That was the name of the event. It was,
It was
it,
right there.
yeah, it was whatever Evo was called before that. But remember
Okay.
when, remember the first ever US versus Japan exhibition, when the US players
Right.
came to
Mm-hmm.
America, and
Mm-hmm.
that's when they kind of showed, the different possibilities, and
Sure.
different things that you could do with that game. But we'll talk about that after the break. But we'll go ahead and take our first
Okay.
break now, guys. Stick around. We're gonna take a quick break. Be back in a couple minutes with more Mutant XPerience podcast with Paulee. Don't go anywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to more Mutant XPerience podcast, episode 47, with SoCal Ken legend paulee. Paul, I want to fast forward a little bit, talk a little bit about the first ever SBO. For those of you who don't know in the chat, paulee was part of the very first Super Battle Opera, Togeki 2003. You went there with Pyrolee and Alex Valle, who we've talked about a lot so far in this podcast, and deservingly so. And so 2003, the game's been out for about 3 years or so. Again, this was pre really internet boom, and pre all the resources that players have now to learn a game. And so even though the game's been out for quite a long amount of time, it was still, as you described before the break, still very in the early days of Third Strike, and coupled with the fact that it wasn't really all that popular. And so, at least in SoCal, I know Austin, they had their own kind of little scene with Shien and Mopreme and all that. But before we get to Togeki, actually, now that I'm kind of reminded of it, you were one of the first players, at least that I remember, along with Mopreme and Slim X. Obviously, Slim X came out with those cool combo videos. But you were one of the first players. Well, actually, no, you are the first player that I ever heard, talk about frame data. Right, like you were like just me, right? I'm sure other people had talked about frame data, but you were kind of the first person that I remember talking about frame data, and I can sort of distinctly remember when it was. It had to have been after a Camelot event or tournament, and I remember one day, and this didn't happen very rarely, but I think you, me, and Ken I went to In and Out in Fullerton after Camelot.
Yeah,
and you were talking about why the Japanese are so much better than us. How their approach to the game is so much more sort of technical and scientific than Americans. And then you started talking about frame data and stuff like that. And it was really the first time I had ever heard of any concept in terms of math and Street Fighter. Because, I didn't really equate the two, you know what I mean? And so where did that come from in terms of, and kind of speak on how hard it was, or at least in your mind, compared to nowadays, how difficult it was to kind of get that kind of information about Third Strike, or any game, really?
I don't remember specifically the conversation that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I'll be able to answer that very well. But
well, just in terms of how did you start learning about frame data and stuff like that? Like how did that, how did you start paying attention to that kind of stuff?
I just, I don't think we spoke of it in terms of frame data back then. It was more just recovery frames, hitboxes, and hurtboxes and whatnot. So this might have been about the time when, we were talking on the break, but there was a U.S. versus Japanese exposition that happened. I think it was in the first Evo, and they came and just styled on our team, just absolutely wrecked our team. And they were doing unblockables with Urian. They were doing Genai Jin, which we had never seen before. And I think, Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first time we saw the crouching strong from Ken, which was my bread and butter for years. Mm-hmm. And we had to try to figure out why these things worked the way they did. So that's when we learned about basically hitboxes and hurtboxes and how powerful. So the crouching strong, had a hitbox that when somebody would walk forward, crouching forward, they'd run their hurtbox straight into the crouching strong. Right? So the strong would just out prioritize it. And back then, all we just said, oh, well, has a high priority move, but we didn't really just understand the interaction between hitboxes and hurtboxes. Or things like recovery frames. So for instance, Ken's super, I don't know the frame data on it right now, but it basically had instant startup. So if somebody did something like crouching medium kick on you, I would just super it on reaction, which was kind of cool. Very
because crouching forward on block is -3.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was always looking for ways to punish players when they thought things were safe. So I was looking for that where, like you said, a move might have a very small amount of recovery, and you were just spamming these things. I did the same thing with Chun. If somebody would do crouching medium kick, because like Mike Watson, right? He thought that move was the god move for Ken. So he'd just sit mid screen and like crouching forward it, and I'd get sick of it, and I just super it right back. Whiffed crouching medium kick from half screen, and I would just super it with Chun super. It just hits you in recovery frames. But so yeah, we didn't talk in terms of frame data back then, but it was the precursor, I guess, of that. Hit boxes and hurt boxes and understanding, I guess, how they interact. So the Ken one in particular was dangerous because it had two windows. You could either cancel it, super cancel right away, right? So one of the things that I was the first to do was mashing is not the right word, but I was what do you call it? Buffering. I was buffering super motion after every single crouching medium punch and after every single crouching medium kick. So I was doing that, and if you see it hit, you cancel super, right? Because the window to super cancel is late. So I was one of the first persons to do that consistently. And then I learned, because of the Japanese exhibition, that there was a window in which if you can't super cancel the crouching medium punch, you have to wait X number of frames, and then it turns into a link. So the crouching medium punch, you let it hit, and then you super, and then you're getting all of a sudden these like ridiculous Ken supers just by mashing crouching medium punch. So that became my bread and butter, I think, for a while.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned, the concept of the link, because again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you have just been so influential in terms of the way that I approach the game. Like I that's just how I approach the game. Like moving forward, thinking about recovery and thinking about ways to punish things that are unsafe. Really paying attention to what's and to use modern lingo, what's plus and what's minus.
Exactly. Right.
And I'm glad you mentioned the link, because one of the very first Third Strike videos I ever watched was Mopreem's Link Encyclopedia. And I don't know if you remember that encyclopedia video, but basically Mopreem made a video of every link in Third Strike, like with every character. Yeah. And, I'm not sure if it came before or after you started doing it. It's probably around the same time. And again, right, it's not about getting into a pissing contest. Obviously back in those days, different scenes developed on their own, and to me, it's really cool to just kind of see all of the different things people are coming up with in different, regions. But yeah, this idea of the link, right? I mean, that was so influential. Like, I remember when I first picked up Necro, and we'll get to the story of why I picked up Necro, later on. But like, I remember the first thing you told me was like, dude, just learn back medium with the super. Just learn back medium, back strong into super. That's all I practiced for like the first 3 months. Just back strong into super. So let's talk a little bit about that first SBO, because like I said before, you were on the very first American team for the very first Togeki. And before we talk about Togeki and you going to Japan, let's talk a little bit about how you got on the team, right? Because this was kind of the first, this kind of coincided with like really my entry into the FGC in terms of knowing that there's actually a community that plays, competitively and enters tournaments and stuff. And so I was introduced to SRK around, late 2002, early 2003. And one of the very first threads that I read was a thread that was, I think it was part of the results thread, but for the first Togeki, the SBO officials decided that that one of the American qualifiers, or that might have been the only American qualifier. I'm not really sure.
The only qualifier.
Yeah.
It was the only qualifier.
That the only American qualifier would happen at an arcade. Yeah. At an arcade called Camelot Golfland, which was in, Tustin, or not Tustin. I forgot, Anaheim or something like that. It was near the Fry's. All I remember is it was near the Fry's, the Fry's Electronics.
Yeah.
And around that time, I had just started my master's program at Cal State Fullerton. Interestingly enough, a year after I finished my first year, I ran into Ken I on campus, because unbeknownst to me, he was an undergrad there at the time. I didn't know that, it was funny because we had been playing for years at Golfland, whether it's Southern Hills or Camelot. And then all of a sudden, just randomly, I saw him on campus, like, what are you doing here? And he's like, I go here. And I'm like, oh, okay. Never mind. So SBO quals, the very first American SBO quals for the very first SBO happened at Camelot Golfland. I believe it was around January of 2003. Very close to when Togeki actually. Am I correct in that? Like it wasn't that long between like the time like qualifying and then actually going to Gokeki.
Enough time. Let's call it maybe a month or two. It gave us enough time. But that was a fun time. So yeah, just to piggyback off of that, SBO was a single world limb tournament made up of three players. That was going to be played in Japan. And at this time, Japan basically dominated us in everything. So we were like lambs to a slaughter. They put the qualifiers at Camelot, so Southern California. So the unfortunate part is that it probably didn't represent the best players. I don't know that, I definitely don't think I was one of the top 3 players back then. But, we did have qualifiers, and it was here in Southern California. So it ran one tournament, and the top 2 players made it, and that was Michael, that was paulee, and Alex. And I ran, and then we had to run it back for the winner of the second tournament would get the 3rd spot.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So, before we get into the tournament itself, and again, this is before I entered really the FGC and before I was even aware there was anything called the FGC. Was there any kind of discussion about the qualifier being in Camelot? Because, it's in California. There are other people, obviously, in the country that perhaps had aspirations of going to Gokeki. Do you remember any kind of, talk about, hey, why is Camelot getting this qualifier? Like, why is it just automatically in SoCal? Like I don't know if you heard any.
I think that the scene, at least for this game, was small enough that it basically allowed players from Northern California to drive down if they wanted. And obviously Southern California was basically the hub of Street Fighter at the time. Southern Hills was kind of the focal point. So it made sense because we were all a bunch of 18-year-olds. No one was flying for turn. Well, some people were, but very rare were people flying. It just wasn't a big enough scene to justify like a massive qualifier that we would have today. So yes, there were people that were saying, hey, that seems unreasonable, but they were just like, well, fly to Southern California if you really want to make the team, and to your point, it was mostly Southern California players. It was in our backyard. I didn't make the rules. A few people I think came out of town, but Southern California had a strong scene then. So we, it was us. That was where I met Hung B, by the way.
Oh, awesome. So Camelot. So let's talk about the tournament itself. Obviously there were other games that were, other qualifiers that were run there, right? ST, Guilty Gear, or not Guilty Gear.
Guilty Gear was run there.
Yeah, Guilty Gear was run there.
I think Guilty Gear was.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think made it there.
Did you enter anything other than Third Strike? Or was it just Third Strike you entered that day?
Unlikely.
And so how was the tournament itself? Because one of the things that I read, kind of to, in anticipation of this podcast, I was kind of reading through that thread for the results for SBO qual at Camelot. And, one of the posts was talking just about, how, kind of the conditions of the tournament, how a lot of players were really playing for upwards to 6 to 7 hours straight, no break or whatever. What do you remember from that experience in, that day? Like, kind of take me, as much as you can remember, kind of take me through that day of SBO quals, the very first one at Camelot.
I mean, it doesn't strike me as anything different than any of the Southern Hills tournaments from back in the day, because they were all like that. They were all a grind. they were, like you said, they would last like 8 hours. You would play a game and then you would sit, and then an hour later you'd get called again. It was nerve-wracking. I remember that because I know I felt I did have a good chance. I remember running into Hung B there, and this is interesting because this is a time when I felt like I never lost to random players back then at all. It's kind of a cool feeling, but no, if you were a player and I didn't know you, I generally won. And when I ran into Hung B, I remember having a lot of trouble with his Oral. And I was like, man, this guy's actually pretty good. But I beat him twice in the tournament. So
yeah, I mean, it's even as someone who just got into the FGC, you were pretty well known, at least among Third Strike players. So did you feel any kind of pressure going into that SBO quals, knowing
absolutely.
that? Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. I remember. I mean, we still had good players, right? So Mike, paulee, Alex, and I remember Frankie 3S, right? So he was gunning for that spot too. Ken I was very strong back then. He got stronger. Yeah. So those we had those are the players I remember focusing on. And then Vic, obviously Vic, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, well, let's talk about him now because we're kind of it's kind of that time now. So,
Sure.
Like you had talked about the rules. So it was 2 tournaments, right? 2 separate tournaments. I think you said, right? First and whoever finished first and second in that first tournament was on the team automatically. Is that what is that yeah? And so,
that's the way it was.
Do you remember who won that first tournament? Was it Pyro or Valle?
I don't think they played it out because they didn't play it out.
Okay. So they didn't play it out.
If I were to guess, well, I don't think they needed to. So it was just basically whoever made
grand finals.
So I don't remember if it stopped at winners finals or if it stopped at like grand finals, but it doesn't really matter, right? It was just the top 2 players.
And then the third tournament would determine the third member. And so the grand finals of that second tournament, to determine the third member was between you and Victor Lee, who is, for those of you who follow Third Strike, very well-known, family fun Third Strike player. One of the players that, early on, was one of the more, dominating kind of players, right? Like when you saw, a guy like Vic or Gio, right? We'll talk a little bit about Gio later,
Gio.
Right?
So Gio was the strongest Third Strike player in Southern California at the time, by himself, the strongest.
Yeah. But let's talk about Gio, actually. Where was G? Was he out there? Was he at the qualifier?
No, so he was not going to be able to make SBO, so he did not join.
Okay.
And this is probably about the time when he would have peaked. I think he had personal issues where I think he was in school and I think he was basically forced to stop playing games. But he was a player that was the best SoCal player at the time. Playing Yang.
And it's a shame because not a lot of people, even a lot of Third Strike players, they don't really remember Gio.
No, I totally forgot about that name until you brought that up.
So Gio wasn't there, and so it was you and Vic at the time was using Chun, and so most people know Vic as a Dudley player, but did he start picking up Dudley after SBO quals, or was he always using Dudley and he just decided to use Chun for this tournament? Do you remember at all, or was he just mainly a Chun player up until this point?
I think at this point he was mainly a Chun player.
Okay.
I think he was playing Dudley, but he didn't really become the Dudley Victor Lee that we all knew until like the next year, because he had a really good year the year after that. And that was the year that, if we ever get down to it, he didn't qualify for SBO. It probably stung for him because he really put a lot of effort into that, and he ended up not qualifying the next year. But he was at his peak probably next year.
So 2003, January 2003, the second tournament to determine the third member. You and Vic, you using Ken, and you using and Vic using Chun. Now, question number one.
Sure.
As I was reading the thread, there was a couple posts that referenced a video. Okay, of the footage of. Are you aware of where this video is, or if who might have this video?
No.
Okay, because there's a post in the thread that discusses what happened at SBO quals in Camelot, where someone said, "Oh, I saw the video" or something like that, right? And so I can only assume there was a video, but I just thought maybe you might know some information or maybe where this video.
And I think maybe we should at least outline what happened.
Yeah,
because we're doing a lot of alluding. So do you want to talk about it?
Okay, so basically there was some controversy surrounding your match with Vic. There was, and again, right? I want you really to tell the story because again, I wasn't there. Walk us through the grand finals between you and Vic.
So we get to grand finals, and it's basically, I think it's actually grand finals. So, and I want to say that I came through on the winner's side. So, I won the first game, and I was up 1-0, and I think I did something stupid like wake up super to try to chip. And so, of course, it's a pretty easy parry as long as he gets the first parry in. So we got the first parry in. So he was like, input. And I didn't do anything. And on the last one, what I did was I mashed, and he actually dropped the last parry and lost. And that was it. So I won the whole thing. And I didn't think that much of it at the time. I was a marble player, and counter mashing is something we do all the time. We can talk about the controversy in a second. We'll get there. But I didn't think it was a big deal. I know he had a weird look on his face when we went to go do the customary handshake, and he had a weird look on his face. I didn't know what to think of it at the time. And that was it, right? We moved on. The results thread came out, and he made a he made a comment that something like, I wasn't happy, what you did, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was taken aback by it a little bit. And so basically he felt that I either shouldn't have mashed or I distracted him by mashing to the point where it cost him the game.
Mm-hmm. So what exactly physically did you do? Because you did a good job of describing kind of the situation, right? So you tried to chip him with super, right? And this is where technology comes into play, right? Because now almost every third strike player knows, you just parry the first 2 hits and then jump into neutral jump, right? That's what, and then you avoid the situation because, even if you are confident in parrying the whole thing, it's an unnecessary risk. Just jump out after the second parry. But, and then again, right, that kind of shows, these are the early days of third strike. So you did a good job of describing the situation, but what exactly did you do? Because again, in the thread, there's a lot of, there's a lot of different narratives as to exactly what you did.
Yeah.
So what physically did you do? And just, I know Neem has a question in the chat. So you guys were playing, first of all, on I guess what we would call a showcase cap, right? Like the big.
Yes.
Okay. Where there was like a gap between them.
Yeah. Sure. There's a gap. So what I did, we talked about this briefly in the break, but in Marvel Capcom, right, you counter mash. So what I did was I waited for hit, and then as he was preparing for the 5th hit, I timed a mash. So I went mash up, mash down, maybe 1 or 2 more than that, but I went bop, 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 like that, slightly before the last parry timing.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, right, he's going right, nice and quiet, pop, 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 and then instead of going pop, 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 it was pop, 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 mash. So I didn't say anything. I just went up, down, like that. No physical contact, and that was it. And I think, from my eyes, it wasn't an issue. I didn't see it as an issue until the thread kind of blew up the next day. So
yeah. So Neiman has a good point here in the chat. Neiman says that Justin tried to do a similar thing during Evo Moment 37. But the difference between that is they were on Super Gun, and there was I mean, maybe the table. I mean, I wasn't sitting there, right? Maybe the table was shaking when Justin was mashing during the Daigo parry. Who knows?
Mhm.
But that's a completely different situation, because you're on console, you're both on your own sticks, you're using super gun, you're in the same table, but there's quite a bit of distance between the two players. You guys are playing on, and again, if anyone's ever, I don't know if anyone's ever, if you guys remember this, but the cab that I'm referring to, the showcase cab, it's like a giant cab. It's kind of like there's a gap between the screen and the controls. I think I'm describing it pretty accurately what this kind of setup was at Camelot. And, you guys are next to each other, right? So was there any physical contact between the two of you? Like in terms of, did you ever bump into him or maybe your forearms or nothing, right? You don't remember
no
ever?
Contact.
Because it's pretty close, right?
I didn't contact him.
Because there's a lot of there's more space than if you would play on a normal.
I never touched him. All I did was counter mash, and we talked about this again. So the next day when I saw the thread, it kind of blew up, and these stories have a way of taking a life of their own, and so people who weren't there were saying things like, "I heard that he basically picked up the cab and shifted it." And all these
How do you pick up the showcase cab? That thing's like 2,000 pounds.
Like shifted to the point which she wasn't able to do, which wasn't the case. And so, in my own defense, there were at least one SRK judge who was present, and obviously nothing was said at the time, but he actually came in during the results thread and responded and said, "I was there. I saw what he did. It was fine." And that basically was the end of that.
Yeah. So yeah, again, like I said, this is something that a lot of, older Third Strike players are aware of this. And I only mention it because, just out of due diligence, we got to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
But but like, to me, some of the posts are really ridiculous, right? Like that you lifted the cap. How do you lift that cap? Like it's like how many pounds? Like anyone who's ever played on that showcase cap, it doesn't make any sense.
I don't know.
So, and kind of to your defense as well, I mean, and again, right, take this, always in context. We were young, a lot of egos, right? But, and again, I don't know Vic personally, right? From all I remember, I think, he invited me to his place one time, where he was one of the first people in at least in SoCal that I remember that had a Japanese cab in his room. And I was like, wow. Yeah, he actually, oh man, this was, I don't know, maybe 2004,
after 2005. Because he and I were roommates.
Oh, really? Yeah, it was after you guys, probably, because you weren't, he was living by himself, or, he wasn't living with you, that's for sure. But I know he had a cab in his room.
We were roommates in like 02, 03, something like that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
This is after this incident that we're talking about. We were roommates.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Vic or anything, but at the same time, he knew what he was doing when he posted that, right? I mean, Vic's a smart guy. He knew what he was doing when he wrote that initial comment.
Well, sure. But so he never outlined his view of it. So in my mind, my interpretation of it was that he felt that by me countermatching, just hitting my own buttons, that was disrespectful. Like as if we were, playing tennis and somebody's screaming in the middle of a match. Like in my mind, it wasn't that I did it too hard or moved or bumped him. It was that I countermatched and that in by itself threw him off, which probably did. But and I'm seeing the comments in here. I didn't move the cab. I countermashed. I didn't scream or anything like that. So he threw off his timing, and that's old school. That's what we do. You throw fake fireballs with short. Like when you're sitting in a proximity of 6 inches from somebody, you do things like that because you have natural reactions. So I think from his mind, at least the way I interpreted it, was that he thought that it was more of a distraction rather than me physically preventing him from parrying. That's how I read it anyways.
Yeah, definitely. And, it happens. And I think that's why, when we talk about now Third Strike at the highest level, at least offline, the way the current scene is structured, the bare minimum is a head to head versus city cab. But even then, and I'm not gonna call out any particular names, but even if you play in a versus head to head cab, you can feel the other player on the other side, depending on their style, right? Like if you're someone who really really cranks the stick or is really violent with the buttons, you really do feel it. And that's kind of why Co-op Cup, I think, I can only speculate, but that's why it's head-to-head Blast Cities, right? It's two completely different devices. There's there's no room for any kind of excuses or anything like that. But again, it was a different time, it was a different place. But let's talk about sort of the cab, American cab, moving to Japanese cab, because
so to add a little bit to that, I think at least for him, his home wasn't he home based at Family Fun back then, and they had the versus cities cabs and they had the head to heads.
No, they at Family. At Family, sorry, Paul, I just wanted to correct you real quick. But yeah, at Family, at the time, they were also playing on American setups, but they had head-to-head. Sure. They had head-to-head. So player one was different. Though. No. Well, they had it, but then no one really... Right. And sometimes they ran tournament games on it, but the preferred one was, the two. Yeah.
Right. The high level players always played on the head-to-head. And so I would also, I would say that I think from his perspective, he was more used to, being insulated from that. Whereas I grew up playing next to people. And so, like you mentioned, those are almost like physical tells, like you can tell when somebody's smashing super, you can tell when somebody's about to throw, you can tell when some people are doing these things. And so at least to me, that was always part of the game. And like I said, as long as you don't impede him, I didn't scream in his face, I didn't get in his way, I didn't do anything like that. It was just I stayed on my side and I mashed the buttons while he was trying to parry. but I did it specifically on the last hit before, right? So like I didn't do anything and then I did. I thought it was fine.
And again, right? Hindsight is 2020, but I don't know how much meter Vic had at the time or how much life you had. But now we know.
I think it was pretty close. Like I think he killed me. But and then I didn't address this either. But like I said, I think it was winners finals. So I think I was up one game and I was up one round. So it wasn't like this was like I would have lost even if I had lost this round. Right? This would have been round two of game two. So. And I think he had to run it back as well, or possibly we weren't doing that. But he had a big hill to climb anyways. So, like I said, I was surprised that comment came out.
So let's go ahead and before we move on, we Neiman, longtime Third Strike player as well, kind of came a little bit later than us, Paul, but also from SoCal. First started using Hugo, now a notable Ken player, particularly on Fightcade. Has a question. And so, what's your question, Neiman? Is it illegal in basketball if a player during an opponent's free throw? Wait, is it illegal?
You missed some verbs in the middle there.
Claps? Is it illegal in basketball if a player claps during an opponent's free throw?
I don't think you can clap in basketball, but I think it would be more analogous to a player raising his hands and moving it above his head, which they do. I think that's within the rules. That's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, to me, the better parallel is that sometimes when you see players, take a 3-point shot, in front of, let's say, an opponent's bench, almost all the time you see the opponents on the bench, you see the bench players, they're trying to distract the player. So I think that's more of a parallel.
Sure. Well, also, I come from Marvel, right? So it's what it comes from is when people were doing Iron Man Infinite on you. Like, you have no chance. So what you do is you just randomly mash. You don't mash to move the cabinet. You mash to try to distract the timing. So you mash hard, and then you stop, and you mash slow, and then you mash hard. That's all it was.
Yeah, definitely. So you win. So you get to be on the third team.
Sure.
And then, the
first team, with the third player on.
Yeah, the third member on the first ever American SBO team. But then you had to deal with another kind of, I guess we could say, adversity because of the rules of Togeki. No team can have more than one player using one character,
Yeah.
right? So you can have multiple characters.
Right.
Valle won with Ken.
Yep.
Obviously, you won with Ken.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me how, because eventually, right,
Mm-hmm.
like inevitably you switch to Chun and you use Chun as BO. But tell me, how did that go about? Was it just kind of you just giving up to Valle because of, you know, his stature and whatever, or was there a conversation? Were you, how, I guess what's a good word? How resistant were you to the idea of having to switch from your main?
This is an interesting period. So we got that notice, and I think we kind of knew it anyways, but it was just silly that they allowed it to happen, and they definitely shut down that situation going forward. So I basically tried to push Alex to allowing me to stay Ken. He had really good hit confirm back then, so at least in my mind, I thought we were going to be better off if I played Ken and he switched to Chun. Alex politely disagreed and basically said, I'm playing Ken. So, so I spent the next month playing both Ken, but also trying to play Chun-Li, who I didn't really play back then. And to be honest, I didn't have her hit confirmed down, which would come into factor when we play the actual tournament. I just didn't have it. You know, it's a timing issue. I was probably doing it too fast rather than whatever. But I think I had a good enough grasp on her fundamentally because she's not a very difficult character to play. But I didn't have her Kara throws down, and I didn't have her hit confirmed down. And I think that cost me several games in SBO.
And so did you ever have a, well, before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about your trip to Japan.
Sure.
So, again, you're one of the very first Americans to go to Japan strictly for Third Strike, being, the American representatives to the first Togeki. How was that? Had you ever been to Japan before that, or was this your first time ever going to Japan?
Never before that, never since.
Never
it was
since.
Great.
Okay.
It was never since. It was a great experience. We shared flights and hotel rooms with the rest of the SBO team. So, there's actually I think a couple of pictures. I think Chris Lee put them out with us. So we had the Super Turbo team. So Bob Painter and Jason Cole. I said Bob Painter. I don't know. Yes, Bob Painter. And then the GGX guys. So that was team run. So I think Saif and Romel. I think Peter, but I'm not sure if he was there. And then some of their friends. And then obviously me and Alex and Mike. And Cooney was kind of our host. So we went over there. I think we were there for 2 weeks.
And so what are some of do you have any kind of, stories or any notable memories you have from, aside from the tournament itself,
I have stories that I can't share in here, but it was a good time. But what we did a lot, I remember this, is that we would go to the arcade, and I apologize because it's a famous arcade and we were going there all the time, but I can't remember the name of it, but we were going there. And I do remember this. So I remember Mike and Alex telling me a story about the first time they went for the exhibition for Super Turbo. And Cooney was kind of known for being, that Japanese style is they backhanded like insult you. So his story was they would go there and they were getting destroyed playing Street Fighter against, these guys. And Cooney says, oh, well, don't worry, in a Japanese accent. I'm not going to even say, oh, well, don't worry. These guys didn't even make the tournament. You know what I mean? So that was similar to my experience. Was I was playing Ken and I was going there, and you have to imagine the games at Japan are actually really expensive. It was probably the equivalent of about $1 to play.
They still are.
Yeah, right? And I know they're starting to shut them down. I know they're having problems, but this was 20 years ago, right? So that's a lot of money. So they were about $1 to play, and I was probably winning 10-20% of the time. These just just local players were just absolutely destroying me. They're using Akuma and just styling on me. They played 3 out of 5 back then, but it was so you got a little bit more value for it. But they were destroying me. And then also we had a major issue because back then we all used American sticks.
Yeah.
So
I was about to.
we were also switching to Japanese sticks, which was unfortunately kind of the bane of a few of my tournaments, because I also went to T5 in Toronto, and I got second and third strike without basically being able to do an uppercut because of the sticks. Yeah. Like that's, you know what I mean? Like we just didn't have Japanese sticks back in the day. We were all using American sticks, and then we'd go to a major tournament and they're like, yeah, you have to use Japanese sticks. Couldn't do it. Yeah. Couldn't do it. So maybe it wasn't even the hit cancel. Maybe it was just, you know, I just couldn't. It might've been the Japanese sticks too. You know, that it was an issue. It was a major issue back then.
Yeah. I mean, that was going to be the next thing I was going to bring up. I mean, you know, you're there, and, you know, I don't remember if, you know, I know we referenced that exhibition that happened in, you know, at that one Evo event. I know it wasn't called Evo at the time. It was called something else. But, you know, from what I remember, didn't we accommodate the Japanese in that event? Like that exhibition, weren't the Japanese allowed? Didn't we have like a Japanese cab for them to play on when they came? I think.
I don't remember. It's possible. It might have been like a head-to-head cab, and one side was Japanese sticks. Honestly, I wasn't a part of that. I don't remember.
So the SBO staff. Really hurt because what's that? So the SBO staff. Was there any discussion about, you know, maybe allowing American players to use? I mean, I don't know where they would. I don't know where they would get an American cab in Japan. Obviously, I mean, who knows where?
No, it wasn't a cab. It was just we asked them to switch out the sticks. They said no.
Right? They basically said no.
Because for us, at least, you know, for a few of us, we thought it was a big deal. But you have to understand, like, to them, we were nothing. We were absolutely nothing, and probably rightfully so. It was an exhibition, but we got put in basically like against the worst teams, because we were just, imagine it, like it was an exhibition to them, and they're like, oh look, the Americans, and then like they would just blast off, and then they'd be done with us. You know, that was the expectation. So they weren't going to do any special accommodations for us.
So my next question then is, you know, if you knew going in that you were going to have to use Japanese sticks, was there any discussion between you and Valle and Pyro, like, hey, maybe we should play on Japanese sticks a little bit to kind of get used to? Because I don't remember that ever really, you know, being, because I know they had Japanese, like, for example, at the time when we were playing, right, 2003, there was Arcade Infinity, right, which was, you know, an arcade, you know, that was really known for like the Japanese style. You know, it was really one of the very few Japanese style arcades. Right. You know, there was the arcade in Japan, in Little Japan, somewhere in LA, but no one really went there at the time. Right. You know, there were some Japanese cabs at Family, but was there any discussion about, hey, maybe we should try and play on Japanese sticks before we get there? Or?
You know, that would have been smart. I think we just hoped that they would accommodate us. And then I would say, in our own defense, you did mention Arcade Infinity, but other than that, I don't think we really had the opportunity to play on Japanese sticks. I think a couple people had. I don't even know if they had them back then, because, but they might have had. Like, everyone was using Moss sticks back then. No one had Japanese sticks. We just didn't have them. So I was going to Camelot and just trying to practice my my low forward super cancel against computer, basically, because no one would play me. But no, we didn't really have any Japanese sticks. So what we did the week before is we're grinding at $1 a game on these Japanese sticks, because and hoping that they'd accommodate us, and they basically didn't. So yeah, we were at a huge disadvantage. For sure.
So you get to the tournament. You know, what are some of the things that stand out in your mind about the actual tournament?
The tournament was amazing. That thing was amazing, because this is before Evo was as big as it was. So this is, I mean, it was like an arena, you know, and it was pretty full. And this is basically like, when you see Evo now, it wasn't, you know, Evo was never like that before. It was, you know, they take an arcade and they run tournaments. It wasn't this, you know, MGM arena that's sold out and ESPN and all that. But so imagine imagine us seeing that for the first time, but it's 20 years ago and it's Japan. It was really neat. You know, they had announcers, we got interviewed, you know, we were sitting in, you know, it's like a bowl. So we're sitting at the very bottom, you know, and they're broadcasting us, and they're, you know, they're talking, they're narrating our game too. But, you know, I can't understand it. Except for I know in hindsight, they're saying, oh, he seems like he can't super.
It was really esports before esports.
It absolutely was. It started, you know, in Japan, and it was huge there, and it took a while for America to catch up. There's no doubt to that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you made up that point, Paul, because, like, you know, and I you know, it's hard to describe, like, the scene when we were coming up. I mean, it was just so. It was so different, obviously. I mean, not to, you know, there's an understatement, but so different from now, right? It was so grassroots. It was so community run, community driven. No one had any money. You know, it was grimy. It was, and just, I'm just trying to imagine you guys going there, very first SBO, and just seeing all of the just the time and thought and effort and work and to create the spectacle. And to make what we're passionate about seem so important. You know, I can only imagine just how great of an experience that was. And then kind of, you know, flying back to America, right? The reality of how we were at the time, right? You know, again, not to knock the FGC when we were coming up, but, you know, facts are facts, right? Like, we were still in a very nascent sort of period of time as a community. So in the tournament itself, are there any matches that you stick out that you remember, Mike? Because I know sometimes, you know, I've played in, you know, hundreds of tournaments, and there are still certain matches, right, that just kind of, no matter how long ago they were, I still kind of remember them, you know, for whatever reason.
Well, we didn't play too many matches, so I think I remember all of them. But I actually did surprisingly pretty well. So I know. So we played against a really weak team. I think Cooney said it was probably the weakest team other than ours. They were playing some off characters. I think there was a Q and a 12, and maybe an Elena. I think there was an Elena. So we played a team that was kind of just like messing around. Alex started, and he lost to whether it was I don't remember what character it was. And then I came in, and I beat. It was either the 12 or the Elena. Can't remember. I beat that character. I beat that person, and I played, I think, against the Elena, and I lost. But I missed. You know, I was unable to capitalize on any of my low forward supers, and I was getting the low forwards constantly. So if I had control and was able to do what I should have been able to do, you know, for my lack of preparedness or whatnot, but I actually should have won that game too. And then Pyro came in and finished off that team pretty cleanly. So we actually advanced past the first round, which was good. And then we went into our second match. Our second match was against, I think it's Izu, who actually won the tournament, basically single-handedly. So I got matched up. And I know that I played Izu. I think Alex lost his first game, and then maybe the Elena was this one. I forget. But I played against Izu. I won the first round, and I started the second round with a clean low forward super. So I'm up against Izu a full round and a half, and I don't think I hit him again the rest of the time. Wow. But I did miss a lot of low forward supers. And you know, that's your kind of like, oh, that could have been a lot better, because he, like I said, he basically steamrolled the whole rest of the tournament. It was a single elimination, and he just went. He was Makoto, and he just went nuts on everybody. But I was up a huge. I had a huge lead, a round and a half on Izu, and then lost pretty clean after that.
It kind of reminds me when in Evo 2005, which interestingly enough, if I had beaten KSK, you and I would have played. But in 2005 Evo, I was up on KSK. It was, you know, and I had won. It was the third game, third round, and he had about 20% of life left. he was done, and he knocked me down. I forgot with what, and I'll never forget. And I think I've said this in previous podcasts, but he proceeded to powerbomb me 5 straight times. And after the match, he leaned back and he was like, and then he turned to me and he just kind of bowed, and and I was like, wow, I just got powerbombed 5 times in a row. I had that match. Yeah, I was Necro at the time. I was still Necro. Yeah. And, you know, I was even more disappointed because I already knew going in, like, that, you know, I think you had already won your previous match, that if I had beaten KSK, I may have had to face you, which would have been awesome, really, really awesome, obviously. But I just, I got powerbombed 5 straight times. I don't know, I was just petrified. You know, I didn't want to guess. I didn't want to wake up. I think I had super too. I didn't want to wake up super. I didn't want to be, you know, I didn't want to do anything like that. Oh, man. Yeah. But anyway, speaking of Evo, we're going to take our second and final break. When we come back, I kind of want to turn our attention to Evo, you know, which is obviously, you know, kind of what we've been talking about, you know, sort of America's kind of answer to Gogeki, right? But, you know, we'll talk about Evo after the break. And so don't go anywhere, guys. Be back in a couple minutes. Again, Mutant XPerience podcast with paulee. More to come. Hey guys, back with more Mutant XPerience podcast, episode 47, with one of the true innovators, pioneers of American Third Strike, SoCal Ken legend, paulee. Paul, let's switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about evolution. So you're someone, from what from what I've found in my research, even though you stopped playing Third Strike, quite a few years ago, you're still someone who's been to some of the more recent evos, if anything, just to kind of, you know, catch up with people or whatever. So I think you have a really good perspective on how evos kind of, no pun intended, evolved, right, from the beginning to the current times. But what do you remember most about some of those early evos? Just kind of in general. When you look back on a lot of the early evos, particularly 2003 through 2006, I believe 2006 was the last Evo I went to. I'm not, as a competitor, Third Strike competitor. I think that might have been. I think you teamed up with Hung though, right? In that one year where they did the 2v2 Third Strike Evo. But what do you remember about those early years of Evo, sort of post what you call this sort of resurgence of Third Strike with the family fun players and all the other groups in SoCal popping up?
I mean, it was fun. It was all about the competition, and it was Street Fighter Third Strike was such a huge deal for a certain population of the SRK community. So specifically the family fun guys for sure. It was and we'd run tournaments. They ran weeklies. We would every once in a while run up and join their weeklies, and then there was the SBO calls and all like that. And so really it was like everyone would just grind all year long, and then Evo was like the test. It was it was when Pyro would get to play against Justin, to really, because Justin had his supporters, and they would say, oh well, he'd always beat him, and then they'd actually meet in a tournament. It was the tiebreaker. It was for all the marbles, and it was what counted. So it was the high stakes game, but it was very young at the time, and it blows my mind to see how far they've come. When you're seeing Evo on ESPN, it may be ESPN the Ocho, but it's still on ESPN, and it's pretty neat to watch these players. It's neat. It's fun. I'm glad that it's as successful as it is. I'm curious to see what's going to happen to the future of Street Fighter. I'm not really. I think they need to do a better job of catering it to the online community, because I think 95% of all fighting games will be played online going forward. And so I think you really need to build the game engine around online rather than building it offline and then hoping it works online.
That's actually a really important, a really interesting point you make, because as we were talking about earlier in the podcast, for whatever reason, I think there could be a plethora of reasons. There are a lot of newer players that are sort of getting into older games, right? Games that were not necessarily obviously designed necessarily with the intention of being played online. Things like for example, just a week ago, Arturo, aka NYC Furby, TS Saban, someone I'm sure you're familiar with. Arturo, he is the FGC representative for a gaming platform, or a crowdfunding platform for esports called Matcherino. And a few weeks ago, or I think a week ago, Matcherino announced a very first Matcherino Cup, which is an entirely online tournament. And the finals are going to take place October 30th at the end of the month. And it's for ST, of all games, Super Turbo. And a lot of this was, possible because of the advent of the new version of Fightcade that's come out, which has, really helped sort of, increase kind of the participation of these old games online. So what's your take on, these type of platforms like Fightcade and that's allowed a whole new generation to kind of be introduced to these older games that really became the foundation of, future Street Fighters?
Well, I think they're great, and I hope the developers continue or going forward work with these platforms to kind of enable these communities to really thrive. My experience with them, whether it was GGPO or Fightcade, was that surprisingly the older games, the more streamlined games, have had better experiences. I think Super Turbo actually works really well online. Whereas, I don't know if we're going to cover this or not, but I don't think Third Strike has ever really translated very well online.
Yes, let's talk about that, Paul. Let's talk about that. So, one of the last sort of public appearances that you made was around the time when Third Strike Online Edition came out, and you had I think you had attended a couple of Wednesday night fights when Online Edition came out, which was a brand new, really, it was like the first iteration of Third Strike you could play on a sort of modern console. And by modern, I mean like on an LCD or LED screen. And you had commentated a few tournaments. I think you entered maybe some of them. I'm not sure. And so when Online Edition came out and you first tried it, I mean, what was your initial reaction and thoughts to, Online Edition?
Sure. So it was funny because I did play it, and I did not have positive things to say about it, and it had just come out, and I said, there was like you couldn't reversal EX, there was a lot of things that just didn't flow, and in a game like that where you've got to rely on parries and tech throws, and things like that, like, it's got to be tight, and I know that it may not be possible, but that's going back to my comment, is like, well, we need to work on building a system that is compatible with minor amounts of lag or rollback or whatever it is. But those games, they weren't perfect at all, and they were getting thrown at us, and I seem to remember getting roasted after reading the comments later, that people are just like, what is he talking about? The game it's great to have Third Strike Online. And, and I just, I think I felt vindicated years down the road when people were just like, yeah, no, you can't play that. It's kind of trash. At least that's what I remember.
So then what is the, cause again, you're someone who's played the game from the very beginning, and although you haven't really, continued to play the game, but you were there at the beginning.
Sure.
And so, kind of, how Third Strike, I guess we could say, was meant to be played. But because, it's online now, it's a different world. I mean, like, what advice would you have, if any, to newer players who, again, they're interested in Third Strike? I still happen to think it's the greatest Street Fighter game. It's not my personal favorite game, but I think it's the greatest.
Sure.
It's definitely, whenever someone thinks about the FGC, everyone thinks about Evo Moment 37, which we'll get to in a little bit. And so players are naturally drawn to this game, new generation, but as you said, you don't feel like it's kind of the same game online. So, right. I mean, what do you say to these new players?
I think parries are too reliant, right, on very tight reaction windows. So my advice, first of all, is if you can find, build, or join a community offline, I think the game works much better offline. This specific game. That would be my advice to people who play Third Strike. Or if you're not going to do that, is play characters that aren't reliant on parries for defense. So play more of an offensive style. Play Yoon. Play Urian. Players that can kind of put the pressure on the opponents. My style was kind of, I was reacting and trying to fit in reversals in short windows. Like, so if I saw a player like with tick throw from too far, I would sneak in a low jab or a low short and then hit confirm that into super. Watch for somebody to do a misplaced crouching medium kick. Can't do that with no window for error. So even like Dreamcast, like that version, I struggled with that version because they tightened all the cancel windows. So, it just feels like a different game.
Now, for players, now, do you have any advice for players, say, who do remember a time or who are more familiar with Third Strike as an offline game? Obviously, with what's going on this past year with the pandemic and everything, offline tournaments are kind of a no-go right now. I know there are some places where, offline meetups are starting to pop up again. But, there are players who have really, dedicated a lot of their lives to this game. It's something that they're passionate about. And then they're kind of making the they have to kind of play online. Or they don't have to play, right? Nobody has to play online, right? It's all a choice or whatever. But, you're someone who, from what I could gather, you made the conscious decision, like this just, it's not the same game. So it doesn't seem like I'm not going to play it. Right. I mean, is there anything else that these, older players, could do to try to, mitigate that, as far as, players who are concerned about keeping the scene alive and keeping the game alive?
I mean, so we're going to differ a little bit here, but I come from a Street Fighter background, right? I happen to do well in Third Strike. But and I know you're sitting here trying to kind of promote Third Strike. But try, do what you're having fun with, right? I have a group of friends that play Street Fighter, and so we will kind of just cycle through games. And so we won't limit ourselves to Third Strike, so we'll jump on Super Turbo, we'll jump on Street Fighter 5. Like I think I mentioned to you, I started playing that a little bit earlier this year, having fun doing that. And whatnot, and Alpha 3 is still a great game. So I just, for newer players, there's nothing but more to learn on all these games, and they're all great games. So so just do that. As far as Third Strike, I do think it's a better offline experience. So get a group of friends, play, cabs are available, or super guns, put something together, go play in somebody's garage and have fun. I think there's a lot of groups that do that, at least around here in California. I think there's a few. Watts used to have a house, and they would sit there and just run sets on each other like all day long, just throw dungeons in people's faces. And I know they had a lot of fun doing that. Yeah. So just do what you like and have fun. But I personally am not a fan of Third Strike Online. That's all.
Yeah, I think the dynamic has changed a little bit as we've gotten older. I think as far as, rivalries between, the different old school games, I think that's pretty much a thing of the past. I think now most of the players who are interested in the older Street Fighters, like, Hyper Fighting, ST, Third Strike, CVS2, Alpha 3, I think we've more or less kind of coalesced. And I think the narrative now is like these old school games versus these new school games, because one of the things that I've noticed in the past few years is, a lot of the newer players that gravitate towards games like ST, CVS2, Third Strike, it's because, for whatever reason, and again, I don't know the exact reason for it, they're not satisfied with playing the current Street Fighter games, Street Fighter 5, Street Fighter 4, and so forth and so on. And so I think a lot of the reason why we're getting more new players is because, for whatever reason, they just don't find the new games, as enjoyable. And so I think it's a little different now in terms of, like, again, I support ST and I support Hyper Fighting, even though I'm ass at those games, so, I love Hyper Fighting. I was so excited when 30th came out, because before 30th, there was really no way to play a CPS1 game online that was not shitty. Yeah. Like a Fightcade 1 would always desync CPS1 games. But with 30th and now Fightcade, now we can all play those games, to a certain extent.
I haven't tried Fightcade 2 since it came out. I know Hung was asking me to try to play Super Turbo, but I was trying to focus on playing Kage and Street Fighter 5 for a little bit, because he's pretty fun. But I think the most important thing is, have fun at what you're doing.
Yeah.
And find a community, and that's the hardest part right now, I think, but find a community that enjoys it. for us, it was a little bit different because we were all kind of growing up. So we were going to the arcades, and then we were going to eat dinner afterwards because it was like the arcade kicked us out at midnight, and so we all, I think, developed a lot of bonds. But that's not the only way to do it. You can meet people online, but just develop those bonds so you have people to sound off and be honest and with each other, like, hey, what can I do better with this? What am I struggling with, this matchup, that matchup, and just grind. Like, there's nothing to do but, for instance, I struggled with, let's say, the Genai Jin, matchup, because at the time nobody out here played Genai Jin. It was just like paulee. And whereas the Family Fun guys, over time, they really started to really learn the matchup and perform well. And you got to focus on what you can do better, and it's just like anything. But have fun and put together a community. That's all I can say.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit more about tiers, particularly in relation to your Evo experience. But
sure.
Before we do that, I know there are some longtime listeners or watchers of this podcast that know what time it is, because in every episode, so you're a sports fan, right, Paul? And so I don't know how much you follow basketball, but on TNT, they always run a segment called Shaqing the Fool,
okay.
which is just kind of bloopers. And ever since I started the Mutant XPerience podcast, during the last segment, I have my own version of Shaqing the Fool that looks at some I guess what I like to call some more some interesting examples of third strike play online. And my version is called Pack It Up.
Okay.
And so I know there are people in the chat that have been eagerly anticipating this episode's version of Pack It Up. And so again, for those of you like, Paul, like you're unfamiliar with my podcast, basically what I do is I scour the internet for some of the more unique examples of third strike gameplay. And I pick out 5 examples, 5 nominees. And it's all in good fun, but I like to think that Pack It Up is a teaching moment, right? To teach you maybe what not to do in the game. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and run this week's edition of Pack It Up. And so let me just go ahead and get this ready here. So I hope you're ready for this, Paul. Okay. So again, without further ado, this is this edition's Pack It Up. All right. Pack it up. Okay, Pack It Up. Nominee number 1. Urian versus Hugo here. Urian trying to keep Hugo away, and
oh my god.
I think the clip speaks for itself.
Okay, I'm a little relieved. I'm a little relieved because I thought it was just going to be a bunch of clips about me screwing up. So
no, it's not. No, it's not.
Because I'm sure they're out there.
But yeah, this Hugo player clutches it out. Nice. Nominee number 2, very similar situation, except it's the beginning of the round. Oral player trying to keep away. Decides maybe I'll sneak in a little jump here, and then gets hit with the SA2. And so yeah, this is maybe a little more patience. Maybe move the character around a little bit.
Don't jump in third strike. That's my tip. Don't jump.
Speaking of bad decisions at the beginning of the round.
There you go.
Good punish, but let's not compound the problems here by not blocking. That was a pretty devastating round for the Makoto player here.
I didn't just play that any of that actually. Oh, there we go.
Nominee number 4. So you always got to activate, right, Paul? I mean, you just got to activate, because when you don't, shit like this can happen. And what's funny about this clip is like it's almost like the Ryun player was like, what's the one move I can do to wake up to guarantee that I lose this round?
That's bad.
Yeah,
is that really ROM? Is that the ROM that we know?
It might be. Well, no, it's not ROM. I don't think it's for ROM from NorCal. So I don't know if you know this, Paulie, but Kokijin streams now. I don't know if it's on Twitch or another platform. But watch as Kokijin uses a very rarely used move by Dudley. It works out. I don't know if it was on purpose, But then he gets hit by the wake up super.
Yeah, that was an accident.
So good stuff to Kokujin.
Negative edge bet. Yeah, don't do that, guys. The Yoon one, I mean, what's he doing? Saving meter? The meter's like a quarter of a one. Like, what are you saving meter for?
So guys, pick your favorite. Tweet me, or you can even tweet Paul. Let us know which clip is your favorite for this week's packet. I personally like the Yun one. You know, it's a little high level, right? Like it's, you know, just gotta use it, right? Use it or you lose
the bar is like the bar is less than about the same as Ken's Super Art 3. Like, why would you ever save your meter?
So I want to close out this podcast, Paul, by talking a little bit more about Evo and, you know, kind of its relation to tiers. You know, one of the things that a lot of people like to point out with regards to the 3S history and evolution is, you know, I guess, you know, people feel like there's been like a lack of, you know, character diversity, and particularly in top 8. Okay. You know, there's a lot of Chun, a lot of Yuns, but particularly Chuns. Mm-hmm. You know, when we think about the most famous moment in Third Strike history, you know, let alone maybe all of Street Fighter, we have to think about Evolution 2004. You know, my first Evolution was 2003, but I didn't compete in 2003. I was just kind of a spectator. It was the first time I ever heard of something called Evolution, and I remember, you know, watching some of your exhibition. I think you were part of an exhibition that year, Austin versus Family or SoCal. I think the team. I think the team was you.
I think I got perfected by Moprim or something.
Oh, I think Moprim was using Chun. Yeah, I think Moprim was using Chun.
I got perfected though. I think I got perfected by him.
So the videos are actually up on I think either in the Shen or another channel called Psycho Rarity, which is run by my next guest for my next podcast, which is Psycho Chronic, a Canadian Street Fighter player, plays Third Strike, but now mainly known as a ST Chun player. But he's actually going to be on my next podcast. But yeah, so I think it was you, Geo, we mentioned before, and again, how good was Geo? Wow, you, Geo, Pyro, Vic, and trying to think, Frankie, of course, Frankie 3S. That was the team. Mm-hmm. And then
Mike Watts. Well, I don't know if Mike was playing, but yeah.
Yeah. And then in Austin, the Austin team was Moprim, Shen, Fu
Bardock. We're talking about the
yeah, the 5v5, yeah. It was Shen.
Okay. Shen,
Moprim. So Shen was using Ken, Moprim using Chun, Fu Bardock using SA2 Necro. A Makoto player that I'm not really familiar with named Vigorous. He was a Makoto player from Austin. He was on that team. Okay. And of course, Asian Hitler, who was also using Ken at the time. And so, you know, that was kind of the first Evo I went to. And that was kind of the first time I witnessed kind of a regional rivalry. But like you were talking about, you know, earlier about Evo, Evo was one of those very few times during the year where people from different regions could come together all in one place and play this game, because unlike now when you have events every month and there are people, because of esports, everyone flying out to different areas, you know, people get to interact a lot more. But again, back in those days, 2003, 2004, even throughout till 2006 and 7, there was very few opportunities for players to kind of come together. And so, you know, let's talk about 2004 though, because 2004 was the first Evo where we switched to Supergun. Because 2003 was the last Evo that was run on arcade or cabinets. And so that was also, you know, obviously the Japanese had come, you know, previous years. But what do you remember about, you know, that transition from arcade to Supergun? Was that something that you struggled with, or was it something that, you know, you were just like, whatever, it is what it is? You know, what do you remember from that?
I think the last year we had super guns, it was fine. I think it was when we switched to
PS2.
PS2, that's when it kind of was the end. Because super gun is essentially the same thing as a cab. It's just that you're playing on like a chair, right, or with your own sticks. and then you just have to get used to that, like, sticks flying and whatnot. But I don't think we had any issues there. I remember one year I had a match with I'm trying to blank on his head. Green Ken.
5-star?
5-star, right?
Yeah.
And we were playing, and it was something like, I don't know, right before the round of 32s, and we were just like, screw it, we're just gonna go down to the arcade and play over here. And we played our match in the arcade, and I think we actually got, one of the twins yelled at us because we did that. But but I didn't have any issues with the switch to Super Gun, because it's arcade perfect. But it's the Dreamcast and PS2 versions that I had problems with.
Definitely. So, I know we keep mentioning it and referring to it, but Evil Moment 37.
Sure.
I mean, what do you remember? I mean,
yeah,
I mean, I was there too, but but what do you remember about just kind of like, did you know, like, as you were watching the match, like, what were you kind of, because it's Ken versus Chun, right? So it's a matchup that you're probably paying attention really close to. So what were you kind of looking for?
Justin is Mr. Fundamental. That guy did not have a ton of third strike experience. And he's a player who has phenomenal defense, and just would abuse very strong move sets, which is, that's fine. That's a perfectly great strategy. But again, he was limited a little bit in the game mechanics. So when he was sitting there with full meter, I was thinking, oh my God, do not super, because you should not be supering there, because it's easy to parry, or it's much easier to parry a full screen super. So what you want to do is you want to force Ken to walk towards you, and then you want to do a low forward into super, because that forces him to red parry. So and it's very unlikely, because when you end up doing it, it comes out so fast that you might get the red parry, but more likely what you're going to do is you're either going to walk into it, because it has to be like a 1 or 2 frame window, or you'll get hit by the first couple, like you'll block the first couple on automatic, and then you'll start to red parry in the middle when the hits are kind of automatic. So you can do it, but if you did it off of a low forward and forcing Ken to walk towards him, so Ken has to actually walk forward, that's what he should have done. And you saw him; he was full screen. So there's no reason with half life bar and full meter to do what he did. And I remember I think I'm right behind them. I've seen the video, and I'm like, I think I'm one of the people right behind him. We always got really good seats for those. I thought it was really poor choice for Justin to do what he did. I remember thinking when he did it, I'm like, don't do that. But I had not until that point seen the jump punish, and so I was floored that happened, because you needed every single bit of that in order to finish him off. It was basically the last pixel. So he got the parry the first set, parry the second set, jump, midair parry, and that allowed him to get the extra jump roundhouse. Right?
And that was cool, right? Because another one of those weird nuances of the game is, even if you neutral jump, for some reason, Ken comes out with a toward jump roundhouse, right? Which is kind of, interesting, because, you neutral jump, because neutral jump roundhouse is a different,
right?
Different normal. And so that kind of boggled my mind when I first saw it too. I was like, well, wait a minute. Didn't he neutral jump? Like, did he somehow jump toward, or is it, and then obviously we learn later on why that is. So, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to give you like sort of an opportunity for you to kind of, show, kind of get your input on, some players that you found to be kind of, the ones that stick out to your mind, as you were coming up the scene. And so, let's do it this way. I want you to name me, I'm trying to think of a good number. Name me 5 players, 5 third strike players when you were coming up that you would consider kind of
5 players, and I'll tell you my thoughts on them.
Okay. So, well, let's talk about Gio first of all. Okay, since we kept mentioning him, because Gio's someone that no one knows about.
let's skip Geo just because he kind of fell off before.
Okay.
He was the king of before like it got really advanced.
Okay. So let's start off with Frankie 3S.
Frankie 3S. Love Frankie to death. As a human, as a player. He was very aggressive. At least until the beginning, he had an issue with nerves, and for whatever reason he would fall apart in tournaments. It was very consistent. So he would do really well in casuals. Yeah, I know he got over this over time, but he seemed to have a psychological hang up, and we all knew it. He would try to get around it by using, third-party remedies. He'd sneak off to his car and like come back smelling like smoke or whatnot. But
the power up.
Yeah, the power up. But I love him to death, and I don't know if he pioneered it, but in my mind, he was the pioneer of the Denjinryu. And he also, had Pyro's number too, which was great because, outside of Frankie, like Pyro was kind of killing all of us at the time. And so he would just, if Frankie made it to the other side of the bracket, Frankie would just mop Pyro, which was just kind of neat. But Frankie needed to get there. But yeah, in the beginning, that was his big hang up. Unfortunately, it was he had nerves during tournaments.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm not going to mention any names. Like, for example, like obviously I would mention guys like Valle and Vic, but we talked about them already on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So, I'm trying to think of players that maybe the newer generation may not be familiar with. So another player that, I kind of, remember sort of, distinctly early on, as someone who played, a lot of Third Strike with us, at Camelot was, obviously Kenai. Right.
Okay. Well, let me stop
later on. Later on, Sextaro. Go ahead. Sorry.
So the thing for Frankie is what I think what the issue was he liked to play a very aggressive parry strategy, which is inherently risky. And then I think when it came to tournaments, he didn't know whether he wanted to take the risk or not, and so he found himself in a gray window where he was. He didn't know, like it just caused him problems. I think that's what his issue was in the beginning, was he wanted to play aggressive, but then he would scale it back for tournaments and then he'd end up eating stuff. All right. Kenai and I played a lot back in the day. And he struggled a lot playing against Ken, specifically, the crouching strong. he just really struggled with it. I don't know what there's to say. He always seemed to have a weakness for that crouching strong. When we were playing local tournaments, a lot of them would come down to him and I. I generally came out on top of those, at least in the beginning. Towards the end, when basically competition in the Anaheim, Orange County area just dried up. It just completely dried up. And that was pretty much when I started falling off, was because Family Fun had their center and they were doing really well and they were building up. And we just didn't really have anything. So I kind of started to stagnate and really fell off from there. I know Kenai do a lot of studying, and I think he started putting together a really solid Makoto. I think he was doing like the one hit kill, right? Where it's like the 100%
with
Makoto, which was really great because, well, it wasn't really great, but it was, he figured that out. So before that, he was a bit risky.
Putting it mildly, I think.
He was a very risky player, and his character kind of allowed him to do that. But it wasn't until when he puts together the one hit death, well then it actually makes sense for him to want to be risky, and so once he started putting that together, I think that helped him a lot. Just so.
So another Camelot regular that people don't really know a whole lot about, and I think we mentioned we dropped his name earlier in the podcast. Ghetto D. Don Sneddon. Don, I'll always remember Don. He has the like the way he stood at the cab, right? Like he was looking like he was about to operate a heavy piece of machinery, kind of with the with the wide stance. Like he was in a batter's box.
I did too, though. I did too.
Yeah.
People, what did I have? I think I had fingers. I think I had legs crossed.
Yeah.
Like with one foot back, but also the wide stance. And he had a very, very, very wide stance. Like he could only play in the showcase. And yeah, he's I haven't spoken with him in a while, but he was one of my really good friends. My favorite memory of him was he beat KSK in a legit tournament. I think it was Evo. And for those of you who don't know, it's a mirror match. It's KSK, who is kind of the signature Alex of the world, and Ghetto D, which was like the SoCal Alex. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think he did what KSK did to you. Whereas I think he put him in the corner and just power bombed him like 3 straight times. And so he had a gimmick. So he basically did jump strong, and then so you would kind of like walk forward to parry. The strong would obviously whiff, and he'd immediately power bomb. And
it's popularly called the Genki Bomb, which is why I brought up his name, because I'm not really sure where Don got it from. Like, there's no way. Like, Don didn't seem to me. I don't know this. Maybe you know, but Don didn't seem to me like the player to watch Japanese footage. Right? I don't know. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But what you describe is basically the Genki Bomb.
I don't know if he came up with that. I don't know where he came up with it, but he's the only person I ever saw do it. He's the only person I ever saw do it. And he's one of the few people that played Alex competitively, that would still main him. Like I played Alex. Alex is fun, but I think he had to have made it up, right? Like he's the only one that did it. He was the only one that did it. I love Don. Don's my favorite. He would always rattle off like a game and a half to me. Like he would be winning, just dominating me, and then I would win like every time though. Like Regency.
Well, as Ken should in that matchup. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. But he would be for whatever reason he would be ahead like one game, one round every time, and just lose.
Yeah.
Sorry, Don.
Definitely.
I love you.
Shout out to Don. And again, I don't want to put Don on blast, but he used to hawk loogies on the gaps between.
Yeah. Don was Don.
Get
no mistaking in the arcade. You didn't finish your statement. So we'd be in the arcade, right? We're full carpet. There's like a kid's party going on in the background. So it's not like we're playing outside or anything. And he would just like sit in between arcade machines. Great.
It's not funny, guys. I'm not condoning this kind of behavior, but it's just.
Oh, it's definitely funny.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Behind my back, Don was great. Like as it is, like people would get upset certain times, and I think he had my back a couple times where some like random guy would start jawing at me, and then Ghetto D would like stand up behind me and start. You got a problem?
Yeah. I remember Don would always fuck with Ken, right? He would always fuck with Ken High for some reason. But shout outs to Ghetto D wherever you are, Don. I hope you're still playing Third Strike, maybe on some like alternate secret, identity on Fightcade or something.
Yeah.
So another name, and I know we mentioned him, a few times in passing, but Watson. We know that Mike, unfortunately, Super Arcade had just closed, about a year ago. But I was fortunate enough. I think it was in December of 2018 to be able to visit Super Arcade right before it closed. Mm-hmm. And so, Mike, he grew up in the same city that I grew up in, Monterey Park. Monterey Park was known as, one of those places. It was kind of like, it was in many ways more Chinatown than LA Chinatown, right?
Oh, yeah.
LA
absolutely.
Chinatown was kind of dead a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so, Monterey Park, I mean, if you lived there, you were just surrounded by video games. I mean, just video game store after video game store. I remember playing I don't even think I played it because there was such a long line to play it. But I remember the first time I saw New Challengers was at a video game store in Monterey Park called V Games. And I think Watson might have been there, when New Challengers first came out, which obviously was a big deal, right? Because it was a brand new, technology, brand new system, CPS2. But Watson, what do you remember?
Well, I'm really good friends with Mike, and he's an interesting study when it comes to Third Strike, because much like Justin, Mike was also Mr. Fundamental. So that guy, his entire game revolved around playing footsies with a walk towards and crouch medium kick, and just being absolutely amazing with that pixel perfect range. And then he'd put you in the corner and then, play rock, paper, scissors on the wake up. And I think he was one of the first players that ever shimmied before that was a thing, right? Like no one shimmied back then. Mm-hmm. And he would walk in your face and just stand right outside your throw range and just wait, and just react to what you did. And it was the most frightening thing anybody could ever do to you, was just stand right outside your throw range and just do nothing, because he would just counter, you whiff throw, and then all of a sudden you're eating low forward, uppercut, and then he's still right there, or else he would walk forward and throw and then just do it again. Like it was such a great, learned a lot about the corner pressure game from him. For whatever reason, he struggled with some of, I guess, the more advanced tactics. Like he never figured out the crouching medium punch link with Ken, which I thought was hilarious.
well, I got to play him. I got to play him a couple years ago. Again, like I said before, when I went to Super, and he's definitely gotten better.
With the crouching medium punch, though. That's all I'm talking about.
Yeah, I've seen him. I saw him do it a few times.
Was it super cancel or was it?
No, it was the link. It was actually full link.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, good for him then. Because during the whole period, he couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure out that. And
he never missed the back medium overhead anymore. He was almost 100%.
That's right. You're right. He always missed that. You're right. So the consistency on those two things is you have to pause. You have to wait before it allows you to link. And so he couldn't put that together. So he would go crouch strong and then super, and it was just too early. And I was like, you just gotta wait. So whatever. But he was, that guy's like the Phil Hellmuth of Third Strike. The guy was just like, putting down all these big names and just, winning exhibitions, making top 8 multiple times, winning against Japanese players with Yun and Ken. And then it's like, oh, he played Yun? And it's like, no, he didn't play Ganai-Jin Yun. He played SA2 Yun, and it would just like footsie you and then low forward super. And that's all he did. And but he was so good at the footsies that it took him really far. And again, this goes back to what I was saying, where part of the problem with Third Strike is that you could use that as your fundamental strategy, and only that, and you would get really far, at least until high level Street Fighter. So he was kind of interesting because he was just so good at that it kind of made it so that he didn't learn, some of the more advanced things until later on. And I know that, he had a setup, and he had people living over at he's renting out a house, and so they were all playing. So they had a little group, and they were all having fun. So he was playing Denjin, he was playing Akuma, but at least when we were playing, he was, to me, just like the absolute fundamental footsies guy and corner pressure.
And to be able to see him and Valle go at it, not just in Third Strike, but in other games, was looking back on it quite the treat, when I think back on it.
Yeah. So part of my point was that he it always felt like he was either disrespected or underappreciated from the Street Fighter community when it came to Third Strike. Underrated because of that, because he wasn't doing anything flashy. But the same thing with Justin, right? It was like he would just beat you with low forward super. But it's like, if you can't beat him, is that his problem or your problem? The guy got top 8 twice, I think, in Third Strike, and made the exhibition, and it qualified. It was a qualifier for exhibition. It wasn't even just, oh no, that one. There's some controversy over that one, but he got the spot in the exhibition over Vic.
Well, hopefully, again, I didn't want to blow this up publicly, but hopefully, Watson is willing to come on the podcast. I know I'm small fry, compared to the other people he talks to, but hopefully Watson will, if you're watching this, Watson, please come on the podcast. Watson arguably, aside, like, at least in Evo, right? We're just talking about Evo, but like, besides Justin, he's probably the only American Third Strike player, or he's probably the American Third Strike player that's had the most success against the Japanese, at least at Evo. Because I remember in 2004, he beat Mester
I would agree with that.
He beat Mester, you know, and then he made
nothing flashy. It was just low. It was just like low forward super and
just being
ranges
solid
where Mester couldn't.
Yeah,
he was just super solid. He did. He did really well. You know, and we talked about it offline, but I hit a brick wall. I hit an absolute brick wall in Evo every time. I would get to the round of 32 in winners and then just go 0-2 against Japanese. Mm-hmm. You know, it was what it was, but I couldn't quite cross that bridge.
You know, to be honest, looking back on it, I think maybe one of the reasons for that is that, like, you know, obviously the Japanese were godlike. You know, and they still are. I mean, they're still, you know, at least, you know, the gap in my mind has shrunken a lot. But as far as the gods of Third Strike right now, you know, guys like Kokujin, KO, you know, Issei, Nuki, MOV. I mean, they're like right here, right? They're above. There's no way, like,
right.
Almost no way American players can get to that level. But to me, like, I think the reason why Watson was successful is because he didn't care about any of that. You know, he understood that, hey, we're gonna play. You know, it's the first person to win 2 games, right? And so anything that you did before or anything you're gonna do after don't mean shit, right? The only thing that matters is in those moments, right? In that set. And I think he understood that a lot better than
Mike's a killer, right? And so I was gonna talk about this, but his background, if you ever play against him in the older games, Hyper, Super Turbo, I mean, he's just a killer. Like, it's amazing, you know? So he has that mindset and that ability. He didn't play Third Strike like a Japanese player. He just played it just absolute footsies, which is good enough. And if you ever had a chance to see him play the older games when he's not even messing around, because he's basically messing around almost all the time because no one can touch him, you know, except for, you know, the elites. Mm-hmm. They have a little barcade in LA, and he'll go down there once in a while, and, you know, there'll be quarters lined up, and he'll just go 30 deep. It's crazy.
Yeah, just seeing him play hyper fighting, for example.
Yeah. Oof. It's fun.
Wow, hyper fighting. So the last player, you know, I wanted to mention, and this might come as a surprise, and it's not Pyro, because I think we've talked about Pyro, you know, quite a bit during the podcast. Ricky Ortiz. So I know, you know, she's from NorCal, originally from NorCal. And, you know, there wasn't a whole, like, I don't think that the scene for Third Strike in NorCal was as, you know, was as vibrant as SoCal. But, you know, the NorCal produced players like Ricky, Amphi, Rom. And so, you know, and Ricky was one of the first players in Evo history to be like, wow, she might actually beat this Japanese player. Because if you remember, you know, I think it was Daigo versus Ricky, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was some controversy over, like, the judgment and something like that. Oh,
God. That's right, because we didn't have rules into place. And it did go to judgment. And for those who don't know, Chun-Li basically wins any judgment because of the way the scoring system works, right? Right? Am I right?
Well, Arliath, you know, shout out to Arliath. He was on a recent episode of Mutant XPerience podcast. I think he put out a video a while ago kind of showing examples of Chun losing judgment, I think.
Right. So, but I think it's a heavy favorite because it's either randomized or it's based on points or something like that, and just because her super racks up points, like, it's basically, the point is it's not reflective of the game. When the judges come out there, like, you know, it's just random. So that game should never come down to the computer judgment, and I think it did one time, and I was just like, whatever. I don't know, but as far as Ricky, I like Ricky. To me, if I were to characterize her, and I haven't spoken with her, and I don't even know if she'll remember me, but she, to me, is the aggressive version of Justin Wong. So she had really great footsies, but would be really aggressive in using them. So Justin, who's like walk back and crouch forward and back and fierce, Ricky would walk forward and pressure you and try to car throw you and whatnot. and she's amazing at Third Strike. I'm sorry, at all Street Fighter games. But that made it so that she would give up opportunities because of the riskiness. I always kind of used her gameplay as kind of a model, I think, for what I tried to do. And I remember, I think she got quoted as saying she would, when she's going to games, she would just try to find something like a crouching medium, something like that, and just abuse the hell out of it. So CVS2, you can see that, yeah, to me, Ricky always played a very strong fundamental game, but was just a quite a bit more aggressive than Justin.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I hear, among Third Strike circles, is how much the Japanese respect her reactions. Talking about Ricky's reactions and her ability to react, and when you can react like that, just the kind of confidence boost it gives you during a game.
Yeah.
And so shout outs to Ricky. I know, she doesn't really play Third Strike anymore. But she really was one of those first players. Yeah, she never really did, but she was one of those first players that kind of almost beat a Japanese player at Evo, right? Like, it was like, wow, she could actually, beat Daigo here. So that's awesome. I believe that was in 2002, I think, Evo 2002. So, Paul, we've come at the end of the podcast. Again, thank you so much for joining me. But I wanted to end the podcast by repeating a story that I've repeated in previous podcasts, but I've never told it to you. So, or maybe I did, but you're the reason why I made Necro. And I don't know if you remember, but at a random Camelot Weekly, you just decided to use Necro one night.
Okay.
And you were like, look, I could just get one throw and one good guess, and I end the round. And it was around the time when, like, I was starting to get a little, frustrated with Ken. This was again around the same time where Hung kind of set me aside. It was like, hey, I could actually teach you the game if you want. And so I started kind of experimenting with other characters, Yang, Urian. And just, if you had never played Necro that night, I would never have made Necro. Because you just kind of opened my eyes. Well, number one, right, to the idea of having a game plan in Third Strike, right? Like, certain characters are designed in a certain way where, you can implement certain game plans and maximize your chances for success. So that's number one. And number two, the reason why it was so important is because, there are some players, and I've described this before in other podcasts, like there are some players that just get it right away, right? Like the Valles and the Justins and the Rickies of the world. They just get it. They just understand how to play the game, like, what I'm saying? Then there are players who need to learn it, but they learn it pretty quickly. Like, kind of like yourself, right? You had talked about how, that moment where the aha moment, where you played Valle and you're like, oh, okay, this is how I got to play. And so, I wasn't on any of those levels. It was clear that I was never going to figure this out on my own. So Gypsy, you missed Pack It Up. It was actually earlier, Gypsy, so you're going to have to watch the VOD. So, I was never going to figure it out on my own. But it was only until I started using Necro where I started going, wow, like, I can't just press shit. Like, I just lose the round so quickly. I always tell the story, like, the first 3 or 4 months that I picked Necro, I lost every game. Like, I didn't win a single game. Like, I didn't win that much beforehand, but I didn't win a single game. I hadn't, like, and I was like, it sort of forced me to kind of go, wait a minute, this is how you play the game. Because with Necro, and again, I don't know how you feel about the character, but like, Necro has to earn everything. Almost nothing he does is safe. Everything could be punished. You literally have to earn everything with Necro. You have to make the opponent do something that is unsafe to win with him at the highest level. Whether it's throwing out baits or moving in and out of ranges and shit like that. Like, you literally have to earn everything. And if it wasn't for you using Necro that one Camelot tournament, I would never have picked up the character. So
I love Necro as a character.
Yeah.
And I really wish, I'm telling you this, that I really wish that you and I had spent more time because I really liked playing against Necro, and I really liked how your Necro evolved. You really did pick up the idea of how to play Necro as you grew. And Necro is a snowball character, right? You want to put him in a position where you basically get your guess right, and then they get stunned and die, and that's the game plan. It's a fun matchup. I think Ken versus Necro, and it was my weakness, which I guess I can tell now. No, my weakness was that towards and strong. The
neutral strong, yeah.
Right. So the neutral strong for Necro is a great tool because the hitbox goes out wide, and it forces me to have to match up my footsies almost pixel perfect, so that I watch you miss it, and then I walk forward and hit your recovery with the towards the walk forward and crouching medium kick. And so I'm sitting there with Mike, and Mike Watson is like, oh, this is such an easy matchup. You just forwards and forward him. But what he doesn't realize is he's like one of the best in the world at that. And that's not something that I'm really good at. I tended to cheat with my crouching medium kick. And again, I'm buffering and I'm watching to see if you're standing, and it just doesn't translate well. So I loved that matchup. I loved where your Necro went. And I wish that we had more time to explore that, because I think it's a really fun matchup.
Well, Paul, if anything, if this whole pandemic stuff clears up, and maybe, Don's Arcade starts up again or something, who knows? I think, I can't speak for anyone else, but, I think it would be nice to see you, at another offline.
You're going to have to do like a 25 year anniversary or something.
Well, we did Jazzy Circuit, this past year, for the 20th anniversary, but we'll see what happens. Yeah. So guys, thanks again for tuning in to today's podcast. The next podcast is actually going to be, for now, I think it's going to be on November 5th. That's a Thursday. I'm going to have the Canadian Street Fighter player, Psycho Chronic, who runs the, this YouTube channel called Psycho Rarity. He has so much old footage, not just Third Strike, but all sorts of games. I know a lot of people associate the Shen with, as the YouTube, repository for Third Strike footage. But, we would be remiss if we didn't, acknowledge the contributions of Psycho Chronic and the Psycho Rarity channel. But again, guys, that's it for today's episode of the Mutant XPerience podcast. This will be up on YouTube probably, depending on how the Lakers do tonight. Depending on how the Lakers do tonight. Well, hopefully it'll be up, by the end of tonight, or if the latest, by tomorrow morning. Once again, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. Again, if you like this podcast, check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mutant XPerience, for other podcasts. And so the march to episode 50 rolls on. Thank you again, Paul. Thank you for everyone who joined us. And I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for having me.